Good morning, everybody, and good morning to people online and people on the room. I begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's my honor to introduce our speaker this morning, Sonia Bussu. Sonia is an associate professor in public policy at the School of Government at the University of Birmingham, where incidentally I did my PhD. Many of us have read and engaged Sonia's work on democracy-driven governance, co-designing for production, and she kindly gifted our center her latest work on embedding participatory governance with Adrian Bua. So Sonia has collaborated with many of our colleagues here from the center, including co-convening the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group of the Political Studies Association in the UK, as well as co-editing the Journal of Deliberative Democracy with Hans and Lucy, among other collaboration. Sonia is a close friend of the center. I've known her since we were academic babies during her PhD days when she was working at the London School of Economics. And we're incredibly grateful that she accepted our invitation to make such a long trip here in Canberra just before the semester starts in the UK, in between moving homes and moving workplaces, because Sonia was just in Manchester Metropolitan University before moving to Birmingham. Today, we have the privilege of hearing her talk about her excellent work with Katy Rubin and James Duggan, and of course, with the young people of Greater Manchester as well. So Sonia's presentation is recorded, but the Q&A will not be recorded. If you are leaving earlier than the end of the seminar, just please flag that to me so I can get your questions ahead of time. Without further ado, welcome Sonia Bussu to Canberra.
Thanks for inviting me. It is a great honor for me. Obviously, and special thanks to Nicole for organizing this visiting to Australia. It's my first time to Australia as well, so it's very exciting for me, and I'm looking forward to finally seeing the kangaroos as well. But it's also great to meet so many of you in person after I've seen you on Twitter and exchanged via emails. So today I'll tell you more about a fairly experimental project that bridges participatory deliberative democracy, participatory research, and even the commons and community development. And this is an effort to respond to some of the limitations that we see in the current practice of democratic innovations, which are often designed by experts in the democratic sector or in academia or state institutions, and tend to be one-off events, although there are increasing efforts at institutionalization with mixed results, and often existing vacuums, so quite far removed from the public sphere actually, and often bypassing existing grassroots action. And for this, I believe they often struggle to embed, and the social capital that they help create is very fragile and mostly very quickly disperse after the process. And this risk perhaps depoliticizing issues, but also because of this, there is less attention to follow up and what we might call participatory scrutiny and oversight, so what happens next. So feedback on implementation is often left to the goodwill of policymakers that even when they are sympathetic to these processes, have to deal with ever-developing political and policy pressures and environment or resistance from the bureaucracy, so their attention span is pretty short. And because democratic innovations are often quite far from civil society, and most people don't notice processes are even happening, there is then limited ownership and bottom-up pressure for implementation of citizen ideas. So with this project, we try to take a different approach and work quite differently. And we were lucky because we got funding as part of a program that was called Rethinking Public Dialogue. So they were quite open to more experimental approaches. And this was funded by UKRI in collaboration with the Royal Society of the Arts. So I'll give you a brief overview of this project that is called Mindset Revolution, and it's about young people influencing change in mental health policies, and explain how an assemblage perspective informed this approach. And but also in evaluating this work, we are testing the analytical power of assemblage to help us understand, make sense of what happened. So I was the PI of this project that was really a partnership between very different stakeholders. Practitioners like Katy Rubin, who is a legislative theatre expert, and a lot of local charities, grassroots groups that work closely with institutions and community groups to support young people's mental health and strengthen their participation in policymaking. And we also employed 23 young people between 16 and 25 years of age as co-designers and co-designers of their own participatory spaces. And we paid them. We paid them above the living wage, and I think this was crucial to at least attempt to create more equal relationships between the adults and the young people in the team. And so the sort of understanding of this participatory democracy underpinning the project was as relational, situated, practice-centered, realized through multiple overlapping interconnected spaces, which is really inspired by an assemblage perspective. And our aim was to create space for a continuous dialogue between citizens, between young people, the wider community, and decision makers. And we wanted this process to be really grounded in the local community and building rather than bypassing or replicating existing grassroots action. So from the offset, we really placed a strong emphasis on participatory scrutiny. And this is because the young people that got involved were not as interested in participation or learning skill as much as to actually change things. So they all have more or less direct experience of poor mental health and navigating the mental health support system, and they really wanted to see change. So that became a priority and sort of also influenced and shaped the approach to the project. And so this approach was informed by assemblage theory. And so this understanding of participation as an ecology, if you like, of different co-functioning but autonomous spaces. And the epistemological commitment of assemblage really underpinned the project. So methodological openness, flexibility, and uncertainty. We really did a lot of experimentation. So the program used the word pilot. I'm not particularly fond of the term, but we certainly experimented. And assemblage really helps us capture the uncertainty in both participatory spaces and also the practices and policymaking pathways. And so it forced us to question assumptions that they are simply determinable by abstract rationalities or designed in particularly bureaucratic size and then implemented in a linear way. So instead, these processes really emerge through the relational and interactive configuration of actors, events, materials, and projects across complex social and political spaces, as articulated through relations. And critically, assemblages consist of and create spatialities. So a participatory assemblage can claim new democratic territory and is made and remade, being in a continuously changing state of becoming, as Hans has also explored and described beautifully in his recent work. And so we follow human geographers during Mass's conceptualization of space as imbued with relationships. So Massey argues that if time is a dimension of succession, where things happen sequentially, space is the dimension of simultaneity and multiplicity, the dimension of being, if you like, where things exist at the same time. And so in Massey's term, space, more than any other dimension, confronts us with the existence of others, and therefore the social and political aspects, how we're going to live together and govern ourselves. So an assemblage approach is useful to map out the heterogeneous space of participation with a focus on the conditions, relationship, and processes that can lead to change. And so we had these free spaces of participation that were co-designed and run by young people. And I wanted to show you an animation made by the young people to describe what they did and why they did it.
Mindset Revolution is a project designed and run with young people living in Greater Manchester to strengthen young people's voice and their influence on mental health policies and services. We use creative methods like legislative theatre and the digital participation process to talk about mental health issues from our perspective and find solutions that really respond to our needs.
What did we do? Legislative theatre combined theatre and policy making. Some of us got trained as facilitators and led a play with other young people. None of us is a professional actor or director. The play is based on our experience of mental health support and barriers we face. We called it Mask to Break. During the performance, after presenting the play, we worked with audience and policymakers to identify the problems created by the existing rules. And we imagined new rules together that we then translated into policies. That's why the spectators are actually actors. It's a great way to give people voice and validate experiences that are often just ignored with people, their community, and policymakers working together. We also wanted to create something that could involve other young people, not directly part of the project, so we designed an interactive digital space where everyone can register, contribute by creating and sharing resources on youth mental health. On this platform, we also run a digital participatory process and ask young people in Greater Manchester to help us map problems surrounding mental health and propose their own ideas to make things better. We then discussed and developed these ideas together in a series of online dialogues. The result is our Mindset Revolution Manifesto, which includes 12 policy ideas on how to make mental health service inclusive and accessible, improve mental health support in education settings, do more co-production with young people at the forefront.
The Mindset Revolution legacy. We also did our own evaluation from young people's own perspective. We started a new podcast series to help us explore our experience of mental health and link it to our own cultural issues and how that's not really explored in current mental health settings. We like that we were given a space to lead on this and make a decision as a democratic group. And we want more youth-led democracy, and policymakers should take it seriously.
Oops. Okay, so I'm not sure what's happening with the slides. Yeah, so in a nutshell, we have these different spaces of participation using different modes of getting together and discussing issues with young people, policymakers, and the wider community. And Optimistic Minds is our previous project where we only use legislative theatre. And so we used all these proposals to form a manifesto, the Mindset Revolution Manifesto for Changing Youth Mental Health. And we presented it to the Greater Manchester Youth Combined Authority, which is the institutional space of youth representation in Greater Manchester. And then through our partners, we're also taking this manifesto to various services and institutions. I think, you know, like I could spend a whole seminar talking about legislative theatre. It's really exciting practice, and maybe we can talk about it more during the Q&A. But it really brings play and fun into policymaking. It's also very participatory, but also very deliberative process. And young people reflect and engage with each other's experience of mental health and identify structural causes and collective responses. And then the performance is also very inclusive. There is a deliberative process involving the wider community. So the young people invite their friends and their family. We invite services, policymakers. The policymaking team in the room is there to make commitments. And it makes accountability very visible. So we have a big screen where someone is taking notes as the policy are shaped, and then people can add amendments, and everything is refined collectively. So it's a very deliberative process. And then eventually they have to make commitments. And so they leave the room with some commitments that we're going to chase them about. But we also want to go beyond the young people involved directly in the projects and their community, and reach out to other groups in Greater Manchester and across the region working on youth mental health, and create connections. So we use the CDIM. Many of you will be familiar with this participatory platform of civic tech and free open source software. It means we decide in Catalan. And the young people had no experience of digital participation design. They met in person weekly with support from the academic team. And then we have our partner based in Barcelona, Platonic. So there's among the developers of the CDIM, and they helped us, they guide us through this process. But you know, the young people had free rein to play with the various components and sort of shape their space. And we did a lot of in-person, hybrid, using WhatsApp group, all sorts of connections in the name of flexibility to include people depending on their circumstances. And then through long discussions, so eventually we shaped up this participatory process articulated into different phases in order to map problems surrounding mental health the young people want to talk about, then inviting proposals to be submitted to the platform, and then discussing, voting on proposals. We organized a series of youth-led online dialogues with policymakers and other young people. And eventually we ended up with 3 proposals that together with the legislative theatre's proposal formed our manifesto. And this is an extract from the manifesto. And but the young people also did their own evaluation. So young people are often observed, tested, and so this positions them as passive actors of social change. So they never have a real opportunity to analyze and engage with their experiences. But in this project, their perspective and experience of the project and their participation in it really guided the design of the process, which was very flexible and adaptable. And so the evaluation of its impact as well was based on young people's perspective, and this forced us to challenge some underlying assumption about how young people participate. And really participatory research challenges some traditional precepts about expertise and validity, and treats research as a collective process. And so the young people put together this playbook, and here you can see the cover and the content page where they really reflected on the learning. And they use very creative methods to reflect on this experience, including drawing, poetry. The podcast series was developed serendipitously through engagement, and it becomes a central element of this project, where young people engaged in this anonymous recorded conversation about really important problem of the impact of cultural background on mental health. And this was a very diverse group, and often these issues are completely glossed over by research and by policymaking. And so obviously this was a very ethnographic project, so there was a lot of participatory observation as we were all embedded in this work. And the CDM also has an accountability function that the young people renamed Policy Change Tracker. And so they basically are now reclaiming their right to follow up. So in this function, we added all the policies from the manifesto, and they can track progress, and they know who was committed to what, and they can follow up with the backing of the partners and the wider community. So in a way, they're reclaiming their right to follow up. And as a method, assemblage can help us disentangle and connect the variety of heterogeneous elements that make up the social world. So in a way, similarly to Giddens' structuration, assemblage understands the social world as constituted through ongoing dialogue between actors and structures. But structuration has got a very broad focus. So the advantage of assemblage is that it has got a very clear focal point of what happens within the assemblage. And so the interactions and relations within the assemblage, they can lead to change. And so it can be a valuable methodological tool to disaggregate the myriad of actors, materials, processes, and practices that can mobilize particular ideas, particular practices, both of participation and mental health in our case. And so the process constituting assemblages are always provisional. And so as an interpretive strategy, multiplicity really can help us displace assumptions of linearity and coherence. And operationalizing these epistemological commitments really is about, requires an ethnographic sensibility. So it is about fine-grained and tracing of sites and situation. And so really, we relied a lot on participant observation as a method. And so we were inspired by a paper by Catherine Duros, Oliver Escobar, and many other authors. So that they also use assemblage as a method, as an analytical lens. And we focused on we used it to try and unpick and flesh out the social material relations, distributed agency, and situated and embedded practices. So in terms of social material relations, flexibility was crucial to keep everyone involved in this project. So we used different materials, different technologies. Actually, with young people, we devised a mix of different ways to help them stay engaged. So these are people that navigate very complex lives. They often missed session because they were unwell, but they could keep involved with different levels of intensity at different points of the process, depending on their circumstances. And so retention was really high because of that, surprisingly, given that, I mean, I hate the vulnerable groups because we're all vulnerable in some contexts or in others, but the young people that are facing a lot of difficult situations, and like if you ever listen to the podcast that is online, you get a sense of the complex lives they deal with day to day. And but still, we managed to keep them involved. And even now that the funding has ended, they've formed a collective, and they have local partner support, and local partners are now taking ownership of different parts of the process, and they will continue work on implementing this manifesto, or at least this is the ambition right now. But then assemblage teaches us that things always change, so this might develop into very different assemblages. And one thing that is important is not to gloss over contingent forms of power. So establishing an equal team was not always easy or self-evident. And different spaces engaging with different materials and technology also really shaped different powers interaction within the different groups. And so this is where assemblage really forces you to deal with these social material relations. And the podcast, for instance, as a tool, helped young people reclaim research in their own terms. So there was always this unequal relationship between the academic trained researchers and the young people carrying out the research. But reached a point where they sort of realized anything can be research, and this is one of their learning from the playbook. And mental health research can be clinical and scientific, but it needs to make space for the lived experience of young people. And so they actually invented their own methods to make sense of the process. And in terms of distributed agency, so we choose to work with local charity and grassroots partners because we really wanted to embed this process beyond funding cycles. And these partners work very closely with local institutions and the community. So they are boundary spanners, and they really created these buffer zones where we could build shared vision and languages and also nurture these spaces. But that required a lot of labor of assembly, and there were a lot of material constraints and limited resources. And I think also this really demands reflection on institutional capacity and support if we really want to do ethical research that is not extractive. So one of the partners really commented on how much time it takes. You want to see change, but a process is not enough, and a commitment of a policymaker in the room is not enough. And so you have to keep knocking on people's door, and that requires a lot of time and space to put pressure on policymakers for things to happen. And we also established scrutiny as a crucial element. So through these processes, both participants, co-designers, policymakers are encouraged to focus on how to define and measure impact, acknowledging and understanding what barriers to impact exist, so that they can co-develop ways of navigating and addressing these barriers. So that's why you need an ongoing dialogues, because it's not just about making a decision and implementing it, and it's not just about having champions and supporters. Things are much more complicated than that in policymaking. And so this can also help rethink agency for impact as a distributed force that emerges from interaction between diverse actors. So not just the policymakers, but also the young people, the participants, the partners, the wider community, and different elements. So different institutional spaces and how they interact, whether they're bottle-linked and institutional spaces and how they interact, or digital and in-person participation spaces, but also in terms of personal and professional relationships. And the personal relationships make a massive difference to how some policymakers engage with the process or not. And so third, our practice was really based on flexibility. So it was situated and emerging from the relationships of the actor involved. And so always having to adapt to the complexity of young people's lives. So there was not a fixed roadmap. We tried, but every time we had to just abandon it, give up. So the emphasis was really on flexibility to support diversity, interconnectedness, and inclusion. And so an assemblage acknowledges the contingency of this temporary arrangement and also the emergent non-linear impact. And it calls for a shift from the illusion of best practice and pays attention to the labors of assembling that can actually open space for change. And I think these slides really shows how, in the end, embedding these innovative approaches in the work of community partners, building on existing work and action that is happening, is what might make impact more tangible. And I think by the end of it, the partners were really committed. So what I can say, this partner is saying, is that we are committed to whatever the young people are saying they want to do next in terms of actions. But it's also young people themselves are reclaiming an active role in social change and their right to follow up. So I really like these quotes from one of the young facilitators that trained with Katy Rubin, that says when people get to positions of power, they refuse to own up and they refuse to acknowledge that they kind of try to use that for good things. So the policymakers that kept saying stuff like, oh, well, I'm only in this committee, so I can put things in place. And it's like, you are on the committee, so you got so much more power than any of us. So it's kind of like learning that I do have a right to hold people accountable, and I do have a right to kind of get angry at people if that's what's going to be transformative. And then this is my last slides. I mean, there were, of course, a number of challenges, navigating different pressures, different ways of working, communication issues across a large partnerships, young people experiencing intersectional oppressions in their daily life. So there was a lot of work and labor of assembly to try and create and nurture these buffer zones. But in the end, I think this what really captured why the essence of the project and why people kept involved. And now they are planning work to keep things going. So I think I enjoyed that we didn't need to be perfect, and that really made a massive difference. Like, we didn't need to be perfect, and that kind of made it perfect. We came together with all sorts of ideas and plans, and some worked, some didn't, but we still managed to create all of this. So I think that was the best part. We were allowed to be human during this project. And I think that's possibly the best impact. So I think I'll leave it here. So it's a lot of learning, a lot of work, but you can read more about it on the hashtag, and then we have our platform.